Okay, so welcome to another deep dive. And today we're going to be looking at this concept, this term, global minority.
Yeah.
Have you heard of this before?
I have heard it before, but I always feel like every time I come across it, I have to kind of refresh myself on what exactly it means, because it's easy to kind of have your own assumptions about what that means.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because like when you hear minority, there's so much baggage, right? There's so many other things. So our goal today is to try and really like hone in on like the definition of global minority itself. Like what is it based on the material that we have?
Right, and I think we should acknowledge at the top that we have a pretty diverse collection of sources today. We've got some kind of researchy stuff. We've got some articles. We've even got like some snippets from some online discussions. So
yeah, a little bit of everything.
We're really going to try to like get at this from all these different angles.
Yeah, and one of the things that I noticed in a lot of what we read and watched is this idea that like global minority is at its core like a statistical term.
Yeah.
Like it's about numbers and proportions.
Right. Like when we're talking about like population numbers and proportions.
Okay, so maybe to get us started, like how would you even begin to describe and explain what a global minority is?
Well, I mean, like you said, like at its most basic level, it's about population size. So a global minority would be any group of people that makes up a smaller percentage of the world's total population.
Okay, that makes sense. So like just to give an example, we have some information here that says, people who identify as white make up approximately 11% of the global population. And there are projections that suggest this percentage will decrease over time.
Right. And we see this in other categories too. I mean, like indigenous peoples who historically, were often referred to as red, they represent even less than 1% of the world's population, according to our sources.
Wow. So yeah, okay. So just to like really nail this down, when we use the term global minority, we're talking about a statistical descriptor based on, like you said, population numbers and proportions.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
It's just the numbers. But I think this is where it gets interesting, because when we hear minority, like I said at the beginning, our minds tend to go to other things.
Right, like social status.
Right, power dynamics.
Like being marginalized, treated unfairly.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, are they experiencing marginalization? And that's something that's very explicitly addressed in our sources, that being a global minority statistically doesn't inherently mean that a group is disadvantaged or lacking in power.
Yeah, that's a really important point to kind of tease out, I think, because there's, one of our sources mentions this video called The Minority Effect, and it argues that like the size of a group numerically might not always align with their social experience. So you could have a group that's numerically very small on a global scale,
right, but
they might hold a lot of power or not face any sort of systemic disadvantage in their particular context.
Right. I mean, think about like a religious group, right? A religious group could be a tiny, tiny fraction of the world population.
Mm-hmm.
But in a country where that religion is the majority religion, they could have a huge amount of power and influence.
Yeah, totally.
So it's important to remember that at its core, this idea of global minority, in its most basic sense, is about the numbers.
Yeah, okay. And that actually makes me think about this bigger picture of identity. I mean, we're talking about groups of people, we're talking about statistics, but it makes me think about these bigger questions of like race and ethnicity.
Yeah,
And some of the other stuff that we read touches on this as well.
It does. And one thing I found really interesting is, the way our understanding of race has evolved over time. Like, we have this Wikipedia article on race, human categorization, and it points out that obviously people have always, identified as belonging to different groups.
Of course.
But this idea of race, as we think of it today as something fixed, something that applies globally to everyone, that really emerged during the period of European exploration and colonization.
Right, like when Europeans are going out and encountering all these different people.
Exactly, and they started trying to classify people.
To categorize, yeah.
And the article is really clear about the fact that this wasn't a neutral, objective process, right? Like this idea that the white European race was at the top of the hierarchy, and then other groups were arranged below that with kind of increasingly undesirable attributes.
Yeah, it's kind of disturbing to think about, to be honest.
It is. And this really speaks to, I think, the social and political motivations behind a lot of these early attempts to define race.
Yeah, for sure.
And when we contrast that with the more scientific understanding of human variation, it becomes even more striking.
Right, because like now we know that there's no biological basis for race, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And our sources touch on this. Like, for example, the Wikipedia article talks about this idea of clinal variation, which means that human physical traits actually change gradually across geographical areas. So it's not like you have these distinct separate groups with clear boundaries.
Right, it's more like a spectrum, right?
Exactly. It's like a spectrum, a continuum.
Yeah.
And then there's this concept of non-concordant variation, which basically means that different traits don't change at the same rate or in the same way across populations.
Okay, can you maybe give me like an example of that? I'm trying to picture this in my head.
Sure. So like skin color, right? Skin color is one trait that varies across human populations.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily align with other genetic markers or even with other physical traits. So you could have two people with similar skin color who are actually quite genetically different in other ways.
Okay, so that's super interesting. So, we're talking about race as a social construct, and we're talking about these statistical categories of global minority. And one of the things that I was thinking about as I was reading some of this material was, how the U.S. government, for example, uses self-identification for racial categories in the census.
Right.
They list categories like American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Black or African American, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, and white. Yeah. And it's interesting because it's about how people see themselves, right?
But it's not based on some kind of like genetic test or some kind of, objective measure.
Yeah, totally.
And I think this really highlights the difference between the statistical definition of global minority, which is based on these broad categories, and the lived experience of race and ethnicity. Like, you could be part of a group that is statistically a global minority, but your racial or ethnic identity could be incredibly important to you with a rich history and culture.
Yeah. Now this brings us to this other concept that I found really fascinating, and that's discussed quite a bit in our source material, and that's transracialism. And it's interesting because I feel like it intersects with what we're talking about.
It does.
But it's its own separate thing.
Right. And like from what I gather, like from the Simon Cushing video and this PhilArchive article, transracialism refers to this idea of people identifying with a race that's different from the one that they were assigned at birth.
Right. Like feeling a sense of belonging to a different racial group. And it's a very, very controversial idea. Like the Simon Cushing video mentions Rachel Dolezal and Sha King, who both faced like a lot of, scorn and mockery for identifying as Black, even though they had, white ancestry.
Right. And there's a lot of debate about this. I mean, like one of the things that comes up is this comparison between transracialism and transgenderism.
Yeah, that's a big one.
And in the PhilArchive article and the Simon Cushing video, they both kind of touch on this. Like, if we acknowledge and respect transgender identity, which is based on a person's internal sense of gender, should we also be open to the possibility of an internal sense of racial identity?
Yeah, that's a really tricky one, right?
It is.
And then you have like the For Freedom video, which offers it's kind of a different perspective. They argue that like there isn't a whole lot of like academic understanding of transracialism,
right?
And that it mostly exists in online spaces.
Yeah. And that unlike, gender transition, there aren't really these clear, well-documented transitions when it comes to race.
Right.
And then the Simon Cushing video brings up this other issue, which is the idea that white to Black transracialism specifically might be seen as a form of white privilege.
Right.
Like, the argument there is that Black people can't just choose to shed their racial identity.
Right, because of racism, because of the way society is structured.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
And then we have this other example from the Reddit source, this idea of dire racial identity.
Oh, yeah.
Where somebody who doesn't have Japanese ancestry talks about feeling this really deep connection to Japanese culture, to Japanese appearance.
Yeah, and they even talk about like wanting to be the race that they choose,
right.
which is really interesting.
It is. And then we have Martina Big, who's discussed in the Quote Goats podcast. Mm-hmm. She identifies as a Black woman after undergoing a number of physical changes.
Right. And she makes this argument that it's not just about the outside appearance, but it's also about the inside.
Right, and that every color has a place.
Right. But the podcast also notes that she received a lot of negative reaction for her identification.
Right.
So, yeah, I think it's really important for listeners to understand that, like, while some individuals do identify as transracial, this is a separate concept from the statistical idea of global minority.
Absolutely.
Like, just because white people, for example, are a global minority statistically, that doesn't automatically validate or justify the concept of transracialism. These are two distinct things.
Right. And I think this is really important to keep in mind, especially when we think about some of the more harmful ideas that can emerge in discussions about race and demographics.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of those that's explicitly mentioned in one of our YouTube transcripts is this idea of the Great Replacement theory. And it's a really dangerous and xenophobic ideology that claims that there's a deliberate effort to replace white people with non-white people.
And it often goes hand in hand with these white genocide conspiracy theories.
Right, which are rooted in racism.
Yeah. And we need to be very clear here that the statistical reality that some groups are global minorities, this should not be twisted into these narratives of victimhood or replacement.
Right. It's a really dangerous misinterpretation.
Absolutely.
So as we kind of wrap up here, I think it's really important to remember that global minority is primarily a demographic term.
Right. It's a snapshot of population numbers.
Right. And it doesn't tell us the whole story. Mm-hmm. Like, when we're thinking about any group, regardless of their size, we need to consider the social, historical, and political factors that are at play.
Absolutely. Context is key. Like, just knowing that a group is statistically a global minority doesn't tell us anything about their social standing or their lived experience.
Right, exactly.
It's just one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, so to recap our deep dive today, focusing on understanding this term global minority is a statistical term that describes groups with smaller global populations. It doesn't inherently mean that they're marginalized or that they lack power, and it's a separate concept from this idea of transracialism, which we talked about, which is, a much more debated and complex topic.
Yeah.
And it's really, really crucial that we don't use this kind of statistical information to support harmful or racist ideologies like the Great Replacement theory.
Yeah, and I think this leaves us with a really interesting thought to consider as we finish up. Think about how the social meaning of being part of a numerically smaller group, how that can change so dramatically depending on the historical context, the geographic location, the power dynamics within a society.
Yeah, like, what are the other factors beyond just population size that really shape the experience of different groups around the world?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's something to ponder. Well, thank you for this fascinating deep dive. It was a lot to think about, but I feel like we covered some really important ground today.
Yeah, I agree. It was a good one.
So yeah, for all of you listening out there, keep thinking, keep exploring, and we'll catch you on the next Dip Dive.